Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this latest European Parliamentary Research Service Policy Roundtable. I'm Anthony TEASDALE from the EPRS. Delighted to see so many of you online. Thank you very much for joining us. Our focus this afternoon is going to be on President Joe Biden's first 100 days. 2 days from now, he'll have been in office for 100 days. He'll have 1,360 days left. But presidents, as we know, are not only judged by the first 100 days, the momentum or failure to establish momentum of those days can decisively influence their political capital for the remainder of their term in office. And in order to appraise what's been achieved so far, whether or not that momentum is being established, and what the outlook is for the future, we have a very distinguished panel this afternoon who are going to share their thoughts and insights on this. But before I introduce the panel one by one, I'd like to give an opportunity for the first Vice President of the European Parliament, Roberta METSOLA, who, among her various responsibilities, is the President's delegated representative on transatlantic relations, to say a few words about how politically she sees the 100 days so far of Biden and the outlook for the future. And Roberta, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. It's a very busy day, plenary day here in Brussels. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Anthony. And let me start also by thanking you for the invitation to speak at this event, marking the first 100 days of the presidency of Joe Biden. I don't think I'm breaking any confidences when I say that the victory of Joe Biden in the 2020 US presidential elections was greeted with a degree of hope over here. These last 4 years have been a bruising time when some of our core assumptions have been questioned in a way that we had never had to face before. We had taken as granted that the US was committed to the international rules-based system that it had been instrumental itself in setting up. But we found ourselves dealing with an administration that was following a different approach, one that marked a rupture with what had gone before. So instead of a commitment to multilateralism, there was a preference for bilateralism and protectionism. Instead of a values-based cooperation, there was an emphasis of crude transactionalism. Instead of global American leadership and alliance building, there was America at home. The pandemic was the first major crisis in our lifetimes where there was little American engagement on the global stage and still less American leadership in a formal, coordinated, concerted international response to the greatest health crisis that we have known in modern times. So the US presidential election came at a time when many feared that the traditional system of alliances and cooperation would be damaged beyond repair if those policies were or had to continue for another 4 years. And Joe Biden and Kamala Harris's victory holds out the hope that we here in Europe can again look with confidence across the Atlantic and find a close ally and partner for addressing the many challenges that we now face. Now, no one here is under any illusion that the world in 2021 is the same as the world when the Trump administration began. And any lingering ambiguities about the threat to our values and the rules-based system posed by the rise of China have been dispelled. Russia's President Putin has been emboldened in his attacks on our allies, whether directly in seizing Crimea and now threatening Ukraine, or through the use of disinformation and social disruption, or in the attacks on opponents, whether inside Russia, as we currently see with the mistreatment of Alexei Navalny, or outside, as we saw with the attack in Salisbury or Czechia. Inside the European Union, we also have challenges that we did not have 5 years ago. We have seen the murder of journalists with limited or no consequences. The rule of law, the foundation of our European Union, is being undermined in a number of countries and essentially weakening our voice in the wider world. Now, having said all this, we do have cause for optimism. In the new Biden administration, we know that we have a partner on these issues, someone who will work to uphold our shared values, our common commitment to the rule of law and democracy, an administration that will not hesitate to speak up and to speak out. And that is the big change that this new administration and its attitude in the US has brought. And we welcome that because it has been a lonely few years. We also particularly warmly welcome the appointments to senior positions of so many highly qualified women with whom we have worked on various challenging issues in recent years. Catherine Tai, the new US Trade Representative, Wendy Sherman and Karen Donfried at the State Department, my own old friend, Gina Abercrombie-Winstanley, who has been appointed Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer, and Amanda Sloat at the NSC. These able professionals bring to the administration not just great talent and ability, but also experience of working together with us here in Parliament on a big range of issues. And we look forward to building on that strong foundation going forward. And it also, if I may, sends an important message to the world on women in leadership positions. I also want to quickly name drop Pete Buttigieg, the new Secretary of Transportation. Not only is he the first, to my knowledge, openly LGBTQ member of cabinet, but importantly, he is half Maltese. And his father having grown up a stone's throw away from my local office in Malta. So I have very high expectations for his contribution to the transatlantic relationship. Of course, for the Parliament, our direct counterpart is not the US administration, but the US Congress. And at its heart is the TLD, the Transatlantic Legislators Dialogue. Here in the Parliament, the TLD is built on our standing delegation for relations with the United States and embraces all our contacts with Congress, committee to committee, member to member. In Congress, the importance of the EU-US relationship has long been a bipartisan priority, and we have seen this continue in the last 4 years. We worked very well when the US TLD co-chair was Republican Mario Diaz-Balart, and we are working very well with our current co-chair, Democrat Jim Costa. It is the breadth of this commitment to our relationship from people across the aisle that has made and continues to make this such a valuable and productive partnership. And in this light, we very much look forward to the introduction of a bill in the House which would place the TLD on the same enhanced formal status that Congress currently accords the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. And this would show that the US congressional transatlantic engagement on political matters is just as important as on military matters. But while we are optimistic about future developments, what happened on January 6th in Washington, D.C. worried us. The world watched transfixed as the shining city on a hill was ransacked and violated before our very eyes. And as the mob, after being egged on, enabled and encouraged for years, stormed the United States seat of democracy in Europe, the shock quickly gave way to the realization that the weight of the world democratic order now rests more heavily on our shoulders. Our transatlantic belief in liberal democracy, founded in values and anchored in the rule of law, matters not just to all our respective citizens, but to millions more people around the globe looking to us for hope and for direction. And this Parliament has always treasured the transatlantic relationship and the return to a cooperative approach to that relationship, which we have seen from the new administration, and allows us to identify areas where we should focus our joint efforts. The Biden administration has spoken of a foreign policy that puts the 3 C's at the heart of it: COVID, China, and climate. In each of these areas, we in the Parliament can work together with our congressional counterparts to bring greater security and prosperity for our citizens. And on COVID, while we acknowledge that there have been frustrations with the speed initially of the vaccine rollout and the failure of some suppliers to meet their obligations, we are proud of the role that companies in the EU have played in supplying vaccines to countries around the world, and our role in providing support for the COVAX program. We knew that this pandemic required a worldwide vision. It is also true that there is a degree of disappointment with the Biden administration's immediate approach to the global need for vaccines. And this week's decision to ship millions of vaccine doses abroad while controversial in Washington, is what the world needs, not only in terms of doses, but ultimately also in terms of messaging. As our citizens get vaccinated and we start to rebuild our economies, we look forward to working together with our American counterparts on building back better in the global economy. We are pleased, in fact, that some of the worst of the trade irritants are being addressed. We welcome the suspension of the measures in the long-running Airbus-Boeing dispute, and we are keen to work with the United States to bring about the necessary reforms of the WTO. Taking one area in relation to dealing with China, we will intensify our work to ensure that the EU and US together set the standards for the evolving digital economy. Just last week, we saw the Commission publish proposals for the regulation of artificial intelligence, which should give business the best conditions to build advanced AI systems within a framework that is consistent with our liberal democratic values. We have seen that the EU can shape the digital environment in a way that protects our citizens while providing a strong foundation for economic prosperity. And we eagerly look forward to making further progress in these areas with the US in the framework of the new Trade and Technology Council. By working together with the US on these issues, the challenges posed by the rise of an illiberal China can be better addressed, and a sustainable framework for future prosperity underpinned by our values can be established. Thirdly, on climate, we are delighted that the United States has rejoined the Paris Agreement and the strong recommitment of President Biden to address the climate emergency. On this side of the Atlantic, we legislators have shown our commitment to seeing the European Union achieve the goal of carbon neutrality by 2050 by agreeing last week to a new climate law. This is one area when we can be confident that our transatlantic cooperation will be very fruitful. Underpinning all these is our need for resilient institutions founded on the rule of law. In the TLD, we have looked at the common threats from malign actors, misinformation, and interference in our electoral processes. We will continue to strive to ensure the accountability of social media platforms, and we will discuss with our US counterparts about best practices and see if common measures can be taken, which will also ultimately strengthen our national parliaments as well. Robust and durable transatlantic relations are the key to successful global economy. The renewal of the economic bond between our two blocs is essential for Europe, the US, and the rest of the global players to return to strong growth. And the renewal of our political ties is crucial if we are to face up to the new economic, geopolitical, and social realities shaping our societies and our communities. So, in conclusion, the European Union and the United States are two of the strongest economic blocs on the planet. But our true strength lies in the fact that we are both, to different degrees, not only about economics, we are ultimately a shared dream, a shared promise that our values and way of life will never again be threatened. All of us on either side of the Atlantic must make our voices heard in defense of a strong value-based politics, or ultimately we risk getting drowned out by populism and extremism. We are emerging into a time of opportunity to rebuild and recommit, but none of us can know just how much time we have to do this. We are facing serious and different challenges from those we faced before, but the good news is that we know that the US is back, that the new administration is committed to working with allies, and that we in the Parliament have many friends and allies in Congress who are looking to work together to seize the moment, and we will play our part. Thank you very much, Anthony. Back over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Vice President METSOLA, for setting out that very powerful agenda and the shared vision, if you like, which underpins the potential for common action in the next 4 years between the United States and the European Union. And it's a great pleasure to have you with us. Thank you so much for sparing the time. If you can stay for a little bit, we'd also really appreciate that, and feel free to come in as and when, just by signaling your interest. As indeed, I wanted to say to everybody, there are about 140 people now online. If you'd like to ask any questions or make any comments, use the chat function or correspond with Q&A support, which is online here, or send a message to me personally, and I'll try and take as many questions or comments as I can at the end. But now we're going to go over to our distinguished panel. We were due to be 5 people. We're now 4. Unfortunately, Jana Pulirin from the European Council on Foreign Relations, she's the head of their Berlin office, has had to pull out at short notice. She's not feeling very well, which is unfortunate. We wish her all the best in terms of her recovery, of course. But we still have 4 panelists, and the first of those is Bruce Stokes, who's going to join us. I think he's in Boston actually at the moment. And thank you very much you're in Washington, or maybe you're in a third location which you're keeping secret from us. Bruce is going to set the scene a little bit on the politics of this, say a bit about public opinion and about the political momentum and how that may affect the agenda both at home and across the Atlantic. So over to Bruce.
Thank you, Anthony, and thanks for everyone who's on the call, and I really appreciate being on such a distinguished panel. I would like to actually start by thanking Vice President METSOLA. That was one of the most coherent and forceful endorsements of transatlantic relations I've heard in a long time, and we those of us who are committed to transatlantic relations really appreciate it. As you suggested, Anthony, I'd like to lay out a bit of what we know about American public opinion and some of the policy challenges that might be possible that Europe and the United States can work together on. This is near the end of the first 100 days of the Biden administration. We should remind ourselves there are 1,461 days in any U.S. administration. So while it's traditional, at least since the Roosevelt administration, to judge progress about 100 days, a lot can happen in the next 1,361 days. And so this is really just a snapshot. That said, while only 32% of Americans think that the country is going in the right direction, that's triple what it was in January. So there's great excitement and enthusiasm about the direction of the country under Joe Biden. And while 32% doesn't sound like a lot, in fact, for the last 2 decades, it rarely has gotten above 50%. Americans tend to be a little bit pessimistic about the future of their country, at least in recent decades. Biden approval by the public is at 59% in the Pew survey that was released recently. It's a little bit lower in the Washington Post survey and the NBC, Wall Street Journal survey, but they're all above 50%. That's comparable to Obama and Daddy Bush after 100 days. It's 20 points higher than the support for Trump after 100 days, and it's lower than it was after 100 days for Reagan. Other polls suggest the same kinds of comparisons. So he's doing pretty well relative to his predecessors. Why is he doing so well? I mean, one reason is that a plurality of Americans say they approve of Biden because he has changed the nature and the tone of the political debate in Washington. And I think foreigners can't fully appreciate how nice it is in the United States to wake up every morning and not worry about what journalist David Fromm of The Atlantic recently called the, quote, batshit craziness, end quote, that the president has said overnight. It is a relief, it's an exhale from many Americans not to have to worry about what's likely to be happening on the president's tweet page. A plurality of Americans think that Biden's policies will make the economy stronger, but such sentiment is highly partisan, as as Americans on most issues. 74% of Democrats, but only say that the president's policies are making the economy stronger. 76% of Republicans say it's making it weaker. It's also interesting that Republicans thought the economy was doing well in December, and by February, they thought the economy was doing horribly. And Democrats just the reverse. So part of this perception of the economy is who is in power. The Biden administration has proposed and passed a huge coronavirus relief package and has proposed another package of infrastructure spending in the trillions of dollars. A majority in both parties support Biden's physical infrastructure proposals, fixing bridges and roads. 2/3 actually support this in the recent Monmouth poll, but Republicans are less supportive of the physical infrastructure, and the Republicans actually oppose his proposals on social infrastructure, family support, child support, pre-kindergarten education, which the president is going to announce formally tonight in a speech to Congress. Clearly, the biggest domestic challenge, political challenge for Biden right now is immigration, where half the public says it's a very big problem due to the challenges at the border with Mexico. Half say it's a very big problem. That's up from a quarter who said it was a very big problem only 10 months ago. So this is an ongoing domestic political challenge for him. On foreign policy issues, 2/3 of Americans say they have confidence in Biden to do the right thing in world affairs. But again, it's highly partisan. It's 9 in 10 Democrats say this, but only a quarter of Republicans say that. On China, what's interesting, this is one of the few foreign policy issues where Democrats and Republicans agree. They disapprove of China, and it's the highest level of disapproval in 2 or 3 decades. They want the U.S. to be tougher on China. And so Biden's base and the Republicans back him pursuing at least some of the toughness that Trump pursued. And that's especially on human rights, where Americans say, both Democrats and Republicans say, they agree that we should be tough on China on human rights, even if it hurts the U.S. economy. As an aside, I think once it starts hurting the U.S. economy, those numbers might change. Notably, Biden's Democratic base is strongly supportive of general international engagement. They oppose unilateralism, and they support international institutions such as NATO and the UN, which I think is emblematic of Biden's own personal opinion and supports what he is now attempting to do. So what can the Biden administration do, especially with Europe, on some of the challenges we face? He's coming to Brussels in early June. His newly appointed NATO ambassador, Julie Smith, was once his deputy national security advisor. His new ambassador to the EU is Mark Gittlestein, who is a longtime colleague and thought to be Biden's best friend. So they'll have his ear, which is very important for Europe. The German Marshall Fund Task Force on Transatlantic Relations that I direct has suggested a number of things that can be done. After rejoining Paris as he did, after re-upping U.S. commitments as he did, it is interesting that he is now getting down to the details of that work. The Washington Post had a piece this morning that the administration has undone or is in the process of undoing 100 regulations that the Trump administration climate deniers had instituted. So they're making big progress on that. We need to obviously make much more progress. The Biden administration is spending trillions of dollars to revive and transform the U.S. economy. This needs to be done in concert with Europe to avoid asynchronous growth and all the problems that would be associated with that. And that means Europe is going to need to spend more money. We can work together on China, but the EU is about to propose new subsidy rules aimed at China. The U.S. and the EU should coordinate such efforts, it seems to me, and or otherwise Beijing will play one of us off against the other. On technology, we have both announced major investments in development of technology, new cutting-edge technologies. Neither one of us have the money or the scientific talent or the market size that China has. We need to join together to compete technologically with China. That is still a reach for both of our polities. We need to begin to work on that. And on the pandemic, I think the situation in India is a prima facie example. We need to, going forward, stockpile vaccines, PPE, and medical equipment, just as NATO stockpiles its equipment in the anticipation of future problems. So that's a bit of an overview, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Bruce, for setting the scene so eloquently there, and also for putting, as it were, both of your hats on, not only your current hat as Executive Director of the GMF's Transatlantic Task Force, but also your previous hat, because of course for many years you were Director of Global Economic Attitudes at the Pew Research Center in Washington, D.C. Now over to an American in Europe, Stephen ERLANGER, who's I think in Brussels, the Chief Diplomatic Correspondent in Europe for the New York Times, and previously New York Times Bureau Chief in London, in Paris, in Jerusalem, in Berlin, in Prague, in Moscow and Bangkok, and a 2 times Pulitzer Prize winner, the real thing. Your take on events, Stephen?
Anthony, thank you very, very much. It's a pleasure to be with you and this fine panel, and all of whom are friends. I would say Biden's made quite a good start. 100 days is early. I worry every time he walks up the steps on an airplane. He looks incredibly fragile. He has trouble articulating sentences in ways he didn't used to. So I worry about him finishing his term, first of all. This is my first concern. I also worry about the Republicans taking over at least one of the houses of Congress in a year and a half's time, if they don't take over both. And that would put a pretty sharp conclusion to this very progressive effort Biden is making, which is why he's in a hurry and why, in a way, it's impressive. Biden has very much his mind on that and on domestic issues rather than foreign issues. They will come in and affect him because they affect every president. But what he's trying to do is concentrate first on getting Americans vaccinated, getting the economy going again at the cost of inflation, that's fine, and dealing with issues like immigration. He is trying to appeal to the middle class that he needs to vote for him. I mean, even they talk about a foreign policy for the middle class, whatever that means. I'm not sure I know what it means, but this is one of the things they say. And what it means is America, if not first in the way Trump called it, but it means Americans first. And you saw that with vaccines. I mean, they were shamed into giving away these 40 million doses of AstraZeneca, which they'll never use because of the nightmare going on in India. And you know, it's not like they're bad people, but Biden had said only 2 days before he wasn't sure the US had enough vaccines to be able to give them away. So you can see what's on his mind. In fact, by the end of July, they'll have probably 300 million extra doses, which I think they'll start giving away in big terms to COVAX and so on. Should be pointed out that the EU has given away no vaccines to COVAX either. So maybe it's Europeans first too. And though Europe has made a start, it's a pretty good start, it's still probably 6 weeks behind both America and Britain in terms of actually inoculating its population. Now, in terms of foreign policy, it is a great pleasure, and Vice President METSOLA spoke to this, to have a president that sees Europe as an ally, a friend, not a competitor, not a rival, not a foe, as Donald Trump did. Trump always looked for the kind of selfish interests in Europe. I mean, he always felt allies were taking advantage of the United States in defense spending, lots of things. Biden really understands that the United States, in a world of Russia and China, needs democratic allies. Europe is America's best ally collectively, and so he's very eager to have very good relations. But that's not to say it's going to be easy. I mean, friendship requires obligations back and forth. It's not just, oh, the US is back and so we can relax. I think this is what worries a lot of Europeans who think that Europe already doesn't do enough on its own. that want to do more. I mean, I don't like this phrase strategic autonomy because it begins to be used by everything from vaccines to, garbage bags. But I mean, the fact of the matter is, there is a lot of worry that, particularly on defense terms, Europeans will simply say, oh, the Americans are back, it's okay, we don't have to worry. But that's not going to be good enough, I think, for the Americans. They're interested in Asia. They see China as a peer rival, which Europe does not. I was very struck also by the vice president's speech, which was very good, but she's from Malta, which is neutral. There wasn't a word about NATO, there wasn't a word about China, there wasn't a word about Russia. Well, these are the things where the United States would like to work with Europe on, and they are an integral part of, what normally we consider the transatlantic alliance. Now, in terms of defense spending, the pressure will continue. I think the Biden people will be more open to discussing what defense spending qualifies, right? I mean, what 2% actually means. I think there'll be much more understanding that countries that provide certain kinds of intelligence or other things don't always have to supply quite the same amount of. There is a big NATO summit that Biden's coming for in June. He'll be here for an EU summit. Then he'll probably go meet Vladimir Putin somewhere. And he will want, when he meets Putin, this is all mid-June, to be able to say, I've talked to my European allies, my NATO allies, and this is our collective position. So there'll be issues. And even in terms of the European Union's great strengths, which are in regulation and trade. I mean, obviously the EU, even without Britain, is bigger than the United States and richer than the United States collectively. There are issues, and Fran will talk about them in more intelligent ways, but there are things to settle about corporate taxation, global tax limits, carbon border taxes, digital exchanges, how we regulate artificial intelligence. We still have tariff fights over Airbus and Boeing that have been temporarily resolved but not fully. We want WTO reform. We speaking, the Americans want better coordination, as Bruce said, on how to deal with China and Chinese tech. And don't forget, we've just, been through a big crisis on the border of Ukraine with Russia, which is not over. The Russians had nearly 120,000 troops on the border. They still have a lot there. They've left their equipment there. That is a challenge to Biden's leadership. It's a challenge to Europe too. And Europe has been pretty quiet on that issue, I have to say. And then there's Belarus. There's keeping faith with Belarus. And then there are issues, obviously, if we want an alliance for democracies, the EU has its own questions about Poland, Hungary, and other countries, how to keep them closer to rule of law. And as Bruce said, and this is the last thing I'd say, there is the issue of a coordinated economic rebound from this miserable virus. I do fear that the European Union, again, is not investing enough, is not spending enough, both as the collective and as individual governments, and not quickly enough. And that, again, a continent of low growth, which feeds populism and anger, will still be seen to be growing more slowly than its counterparts. So these are all issues on the table. Again, Biden's real focus is what he can tell Americans he's done for them. He's made a pretty good start, but he would like European help and friendship, and particularly help and friendship in keeping the region and the neighborhood calm. For argument's sake, Libya, or what's just happened in Chad. I mean, these are all really important issues that affect Islamic radicalism affect terrorism, affect France, affect different countries. They're in Europe's neighborhood. The United States would love Europe to step up a bit more and handle more of its own problems. So I will leave it there, and thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Stephen. Very interesting points. Before I come on to the next speaker, I'm going to ask Vice President METSOLA if she had any comment to make about the observation that he made on your own remarks. I think you did, in fact, mention China. I can't remember whether there was a wider reference to the transatlantic security relationship, but how would you respond to that, Vice President?
Anthony, could you repeat, please?
Yes, I was just going to say. In the course of the remarks that Stephen made, he mentioned that there were one or two issues that you didn't address, and of course you addressed a very wide range, but specifically the Russia relationship and indeed the NATO dimension, and whether or not you think further work is needed on those fronts.
Yeah, I think. And here I speak about, let me start by talking about the European Union. I think the European Union can be more coherent and, cooperative on both issues, and can be more, let's say, united across the institutions. Sometimes I think anybody looking at Brussels is a little bit, receives a convoluted message, which is only clarified too late and not well at all. So I'll start with a self-critical remark. And that's possibly why I referred in passing to the current situation, where we have been very open with regards to the treatment of Alexei Navalny, where the European Union and the United States have been, let's say, talking on the same level of pressure. As regards NATO, yeah, I mean, I think I wanted to focus more on the, let's say, the new impetus for work. And I agree that I think from a global level, how the European Union specifically, yes, its members that are members of NATO, and this is particularly important in the current discussions on our relations with Turkey. That is where I think more discussion needs to take place, let's say, beyond just the titles, but really in depth with our US counterparts. There, I think that we would merit, perhaps, Anthony, a specific meeting or panel literally focused on the NATO relationship, and where the European Union and its members, and I get your point about Malta being neutral, but make no mistake, that is the result, or at least the neutrality in some member states is a result of what had happened in the Cold War period, and that was very, very difficult and put individual countries at the time in a very specific, politically sensitive, especially with regards to colonialism and geographic location. So we can go into so much detail, but understood. I'll dedicate next time, if I'm given the possibility to speak, or more than a page on dealing with Russia and NATO in the context of the transatlantic relations.
Thank you very much for that. And I noticed that in the question and answer column here, we've already received a first question, not that I'm proposing to answer it, to have it answered right now, but really an observation from Tanya Latici saying that Blinken, the Secretary of State Blinken, had already expressed a certain openness to reassess what defense contributions might mean. And so the question is, might this administration be open enough to redefine a metric for burden sharing in NATO to one that better reflects European contributions? So I leave that thought or that question hang in the air, which we'll come back to a bit later. And now I think we're going to move on a little bit more to the economics of the relationship. And our next speaker is Fran Burwell, Distinguished Fellow at the Atlantic Council, who's held several different roles at the Atlantic Council over many years, and former Executive Director for the Center for International Security Studies at Maryland University, and also Executive Director of Women in International Security. And a great pleasure to have you join us from Washington. Over to you, Fran.
Thanks very much, Anthony. It's a pleasure to be here, and very good remarks up at the top by Roberta METSOLA. Very welcome to hear such enthusiasm, but detail as well. Let me make a few comments on partisanship in the United States. And what I often hear from European colleagues is a concern that the Trump administration will return, or some variant will return. So let me not provide good news on that front, because there's some observations that I want to make, just to say that the next 2 years for the Biden administration, before we get to the midterms, are going to be really crucial. First, the new census has just come out, and it will give more seats in some Republican states, such as traditionally Republican states, such as Texas and Florida. And so we don't yet have the map of how the districts will be redrawn. That is always a very partisan issue in the United States, so we will see a lot of partisanship on that. There is continued circulation of disinformation in the media. The most recent sort of amusing one is that Biden climate policies will lead to the banning of hamburgers. And so there's still a lot going on, both on social media and outlets such as Fox News and others. And then a personal observation, when you drive around rural areas, and this is just the rural areas of Maryland, not the Midwest, you see quite a few Trump-Pence banners and flags, as well as "Don't Tread on Me," "Come and Get It," which is a reference to "Come and Get Them," which is a reference to guns. You see flags, you'll see 3 flagpoles at a farmhouse flying these flags, or a Trump-Pence banner. And I don't recall any other presidential election where the flags and banners for the defeated party were still so prominent so far after the election. And I think the reaction of the Biden administration has been to push quickly for the pieces of legislation that they think can really change this dynamic. So while Biden talks about bipartisanship, he has not been waiting for the Republicans to come around. He's basically done what he has to do to get some Democrats like Joe Manchin on board, and used some parliamentary processes that are to his advantage. So, but now we have the 2 big challenges of the infrastructure bill and the American Families Act, which is the one he'll talk about tonight. And I think the basic question is, does the benefits that these programs provide, will they, over the next 18 months or so, positively affect those people who feel alienated from the system and who therefore voted for Trump and remain supporters of Trump, in a way that they will come back and see the system as supportive of themselves and therefore willing to return to more traditional American politics? And I think that's the big question in our domestic politics for the next 18 months. So what does this mean for Europe and the United States? So most of the far-right Republicans don't really care about foreign policy at all. That's not an issue for them, so they're not really material on this. Within the traditional Republicans and the Democratic Party, there is overwhelming support for the transatlantic relationship. I think that in the Washington foreign policy community, we have all heaved a huge sigh of relief not to have Europe identified as an enemy, and to see the emphasis that the administration is putting not only on NATO, but on the European Union. But it's not all going to be smooth sailing. And I think there are a couple of general points, and then I want to talk about tech and trade. So first, we have a very slow appointments process. It's probably the slowest, perhaps other than the Trump administration. And it's not just Congress. We are just not seeing people's names put forward. I remember that when Obama came into office, his assistant secretary for Europe was not in office until May. Well, I don't think that Karen Donfried is going to make it to her desk in May, unfortunately. It would be great if she could. We have an outstanding group from the people who are being put forward, but it is slow. And so right now, there's not always the people that Europe needs to talk to. Secondly, I do sense a little bit of hubris. America is back. We have our plans. We understand what we need to do. We have these ambitions, and we're going to talk to the Europeans about it, but we're going full speed ahead. Europe has changed in 4 years, and I think that Europe's view of itself in the world has changed. Not always as effectively as European rhetoric might lead you to believe, but it has changed, and I think there's also this now reserve in Europe of what if the Americans change back again. And so I think that there's going to be some tension in the relationship because of this American perspective that is much more, we're back, it's great, let's have a big group hug, let's go on together, here's everyone's marching orders. And it might not work quite so smoothly. I think also the US focus on China, and Bruce's statistics on China, the polling data on China are quite illustrative. China is becoming the big issue in foreign policy here in Washington. And there's not really a positive side to it. There's not the balance that you see in Europe that, yes, there is a real concern. And I would say that Europe's concern has been growing. It's nowhere near what it is in Washington, but it's been growing. But there also in Europe is much more of a, we still need to engage with the Chinese. We need to figure out how to work with them and how to be able to enjoy the economic benefits that a relationship with China brings. So I'm not sure that the United States and Europe, and there are many different views in Europe as well of China, I'm not sure that we're quite yet on the same page. There are some areas where I think that we are on the same page, and there's a big agenda, I think, on tech vis-a-vis China, where we can enlarge the discussions that we've had about Huawei and 5G over the last couple of years. So let me shift to tech. The good news, which was surprising to many of us who are observers of this area, was the appointment right out of the box, the very first day of the administration, of a new negotiator on data transfers. So the privacy shield issue. I think this showed that the administration understood the importance of this issue and understood the importance of dealing with the results of the ECJ decision. The other good news is that of Janet Yellen putting a new proposal on the table with the OECD and the digital tax discussions. It's not perhaps the proposal that the Europeans would have loved to see, but it does take the conversation in an interesting direction and indicates the re-engagement by the United States. But neither of these, data transfers nor digital tax, is going to be easily solved. And there are some areas where we can move forward. I just mentioned the tech area and resilience in our infrastructure, for example. And there's also the AI area, artificial intelligence. And in fact, in the joint agenda for global change that the European institutions have put forward, they recommend or propose an AI accord between the United States and the EU. However, there is an issue about this, and that is that the EU is moving ahead very quickly with a whole set of legislative proposals. The one on AI came out last week. We have the Data Governance Act in, I think it was late November, and the DSA and the DMA in mid-December. And we will see others that will come out, I am sure, a new data strategy, et cetera. Roberta METSOLA mentioned the US and the EU together shaping digital rules. I think that's a great ambition. It's one I share. But the issue is that the EU is going ahead with legislative proposals that will put a new set of rules in place. And the United States, unfortunately, and the Biden administration in particular, doesn't quite know yet what it wants. It doesn't have the people in place. And our structure, we're not structured in the same way to give prominence to data and tech issues as you are. That's not the way our government has grown up. Those issues are kind of farmed out among different departments. And so this is going to be a real challenge to get ourselves on anywhere near the same page, and to do it, to have the timing be in sync. In the meantime, we're hearing more, sometimes it's just rhetoric about digital sovereignty. And I totally get where this comes from, because Europe needs to figure out how to have its own big tech companies and capabilities, absolutely. But to some ears in the United States, the question, this sounds like Fortress Europe. And the question is, as digital sovereignty becomes a reality through these legislative proposals, when will they become protectionist or discriminatory against US companies? What will be the reaction of the Biden administration should the gatekeepers under the Digital Markets Act all turn out to be American companies? I honestly don't know. And I think that that is part of the problem, is we don't have a position from the Biden administration that can start to give signals to the Europeans so that we can do this collaboratively. Let me turn to trade, which to me has been the most surprising element of the Biden administration in foreign policy, if I can put it that way. And it is really based on this notion of foreign policy for the middle class. And I think the thing that has taken a while to sink in for all of us is that the DC consensus that responsible leadership should support free trade is on very shaky ground with this administration. We've seen the Buy America executive order and the emphasis on supply chains. We have seen some issues with Europe not be resolved in a quick way, like some of the problems would just disappear. It's clear that the administration needs something for its constituents and is going to move very cautiously in terms of trade. In fact, Trade Promotion Authority, I think, expires this summer. And right now, I don't see any trade deal, even the US-UK deal, being anywhere near ready to go up to the hill by that time. And I don't see this administration using its political capital for Trade Promotion Authority when it's focused on infrastructure and family support. So what can we do? Well, first off, we are doing one thing, which is clearing the underbrush of problems that have affected the relationship, like bad pebbles in a shoe over the last few years. So Boeing, Airbus, trying to work on that. Not clear we'll resolve it, but at least we've given the intention that we will. The administration has put on hold tariffs in response to digital tax, but the investigations, the 301 investigations that gave us the self-declared authority to put those tariffs on are still there. So could be used later in the digital tax area. Car tariffs, we're not talking about car tariffs anymore, which is great news. No threats like that. But we're not seeing steel tariffs and aluminum tariffs removed. I understand there may be a proposal coming down the road, but will it actually, what will it be? Because there's still an overcapacity problem. And will it come before Europe can up its tariffs in response to the steel tariffs? I do see a real appetite for WTO reform. And it's going to be interesting to see what steps the new USTR, Catherine Tai, takes in that regards towards WTO, and including restarting the appellate process. What I don't see is big trade deals. And I think that in terms of the US-Europe relationship, I think what we can see are fixing disputes, working on the WTO, some regulatory harmonization that has been discussed since the TTIP days, and then potentially what we should be talking about is some kind of trade and an environment deal that would maybe come out of the COP in the fall or something like that, be launched then. I think that climate and trade is something that can be put together in some interesting ways that people are just starting to think about. But I think it does have to go back, and I'll finish with this. I think it does have to go back and be justified in the United States as benefiting the middle classes and the working classes. And I think that's going to be the guidepost for this administration, even in relations with close allies and partners. I'll stop with that.
Thank you very much indeed, Fran. Very, very interesting and really valuable, the granular analysis which you've undertaken there, which we really appreciate. We're moving on now to our fourth speaker, who is Jakob von KIRKEGAARD, who is a senior fellow both at the Pedersen Institute for International Economics in Washington, where he was based for, I think, over a decade, and the German Marshall Fund in Brussels, former official of the Danish Ministry of Defense and the United Nations. And he's one of the most heterodox commentators, let's put it this way, on contemporary economics on both sides of the Atlantic. So we're looking forward to your intervention very much. But I'd like to ask you a question, which perhaps you could touch on in the course of the intervention, which is how much of this very big expansion which the Biden administration has already undertaken and now wants to do more of is COVID support? How far is it what you might call sensible Keynesian macroeconomic rebalancing? And how far is it about changing the nature of the American economy and American society to make it more social democratic in a way? I'm old enough to be able to remember an edition of The Economist, which came out on the bicentennial in 1976 as a schoolboy, and I was an avid reader of The Economist, and it had a special supplement entitled "America Joins the Fabian Society." The Fabian Society, for those who are not familiar with it, is the sort of centre-left think tank inside the Labour Party in Britain historically, and it predicted that the next 50 years of America would be about moving left. It just shows you how even The Economist can get its predictions wrong. Over to you, Jakob.
Well, thank you very much, Anthony. It's a great pleasure to join my distinguished colleagues today. I'm very happy to also weave an answer into that question you just answered, and I'm sure it'll be as wrong. That answer will be as wrong as The Economists obviously were that many years ago. But I figured I should talk maybe about three particular issues in my response. The first one is the fiscal response, basically the set of issues that Anthony also asked about. Then I want to talk a little bit about vaccines, and then about climate, because Fran already covered tech in great detail. But starting with fiscal policy, I mean, first of all, it's very important to recognize that Joe Biden really does, the Biden administration really does have an extraordinary level of fiscal ambition. They came into office on the back of a record fiscal deficit in 2020, which was obviously explicitly COVID related, of about 15% of GDP. And then they chose, with the passage of the American Rescue Plan, or the COVID stimulus, so to speak, of 1.9 trillion, to repeat that with having another 15% of GDP deficits in this year, fiscal year 2021. And this is basically entirely debt financed. But then on the other hand, they're going further, as was mentioned earlier, namely that the Biden administration has already put forward the so-called American Jobs Plan, or also known as infrastructure plan, which is also a combination of physical infrastructure, roads, bridges, digital infrastructure, etc. Something that actually looks quite a lot like the European Recovery Fund. But then more importantly, the bulk of that package is actually human infrastructure that I think Bruce, or maybe it was Steve who mentioned it. Human infrastructure, elderly care, additions to more federal funding for state and local governments, education, etc. So it's a very, very broad definition of infrastructure. However, there's another, and then that on top of that, later today, we're going to get the details from the president of the American Family Plan, which is basically an attempt to make permanent things like parental leave, assistance to school-age children, and the like. These two latest packages, however, have they're very distinct from the earlier COVID stimulus, because the infrastructure and family plans are both long-term, which means that they have large sort of headline numbers attached to them, $3 or $4 trillion for infrastructure and $2 trillion for the family plan. But these spending numbers are actually spread over to 10 years. So unlike the recovery plan, the 1.9 trillion, which is basically being spent over the next 12 to 15 months, these are long-term investments, which quote unquote only envisions perhaps spending a combined spending of $500 billion a year. Equally important, there's also very significant tax revenue, basically tax increase proposals to these last two packages. There are, and this is a tax revenue proposals that are very relevant for the EU as well, because as was already mentioned, I believe from Fran, that an important component is an increase in the American corporate tax rate, which is basically earmarked for the funding partly of the infrastructure package, including, of course, the proposal at the OECD for a 21% global minimum tax on corporate profits. So this is all part of a package to basically finance a lot of these proposals, and the family plan, which we've been talked about, is basically going to be financed by the Biden proposal, according to the administration proposals, by increasing capital gains taxes and the increase in taxes on the highest earning Americans. So again, because there are revenues attached to these proposals, they're very different from the essentially deficit spending of the package. But if you look overall, and to answer your question, Anthony, essentially the combination of these three packages, I think it's fair to say, would move the US social safety net probably more towards Europe than anything, certainly since the Great Society of Lyndon Johnson in the 60s. So you would see, if the Biden administration manages to get something even closely resembling these plans through Congress, the great convergence of social models between Europe and the United States, actually combining what would also, if the OECD process is successful, which would be a great convergence on corporate tax rates, whereas of course the onus will be on the EU, because obviously, even though we have heard that both Germany and France are in principle in favor of the 21% global minimum tax rate, it's very clear that whether we call them tax havens or low tax jurisdictions in the EU, be it the Netherlands, Ireland, Cyprus, Bulgaria, Malta, and others, there's no doubt that there are many EU members who have, great problems or would need to shift their corporate taxations dramatically if this proposal came about. But overall, the Biden administration's fiscal plans and domestic economic policies is a remarkable step, in my opinion, towards what would look, as you called it, Anthony, a much more social democratic or European social model. There's no doubt about that. And it would also, by the way, entail much more, quote unquote, European levels of taxation on particularly high income Americans. So far, so good. The other immediate impact on the European economy from this fiscal expenditure is that we should expect it to provide, and this is not including the infrastructure packages, by the way, this is only from the already passed COVID stimulus package. Probably, if you believe the IMF or OECD numbers, a positive contribution to EU growth in the next 12 to 15 months, or perhaps a half a percentage point of EU GDP. That's the positive spillover from this stimulus. That is a lot. That is really a lot. And essentially, it's sort of ironic that perhaps the positive economic effect of the American fiscal stimulus is almost certainly going to positively affect EU growth before the actual disbursements of the Europe's own recovery fund, because it's coming in the next 12 to 15 months. However, there is an important downside politically to that, which is, of course, the size of the US trade deficit. We have just today got numbers for the month of March, and the American goods trade deficit is at record levels. $90 billion or so in the month of March. That's basically on an annualized scale, well over $1 trillion on the goods deficit. And I don't think you need, in light of what also Fran mentioned, this being an administration that takes seriously a trade policy and a foreign economic policy for the quote-unquote middle class. This is not a level of trade deficits that is going to just not be talked about, if you like. So you certainly have a potential major, in my opinion, course of conflict between the EU and the US, broadly speaking, on trade, and simply the trade deficit, which I think also Bruce mentioned, that there will be very clear calls by the Biden administration for Europe to quote-unquote spend more, also to bring down what undoubtedly will be a very, very large bilateral trade deficit for the United States vis-a-vis, or trade surplus by the EU vis-a-vis the United States. So turning now to vaccines, I would say that I'm probably slightly more pessimistic than Steve on the immediate outlook, because I don't believe that the US is going to be sharing vaccines, either AstraZeneca or anybody else. There was a briefing by the White House saying that they were going to make available up to 60 million AstraZeneca doses, but only over the course of the next couple of months, which means that we will be probably into June, maybe July, before these vaccines are actually being sent around the world. And this is meaning that you shouldn't expect American vaccines to play any material role in alleviating the situation in India, for instance, in the near term. This does stand in contrast to the situation also in the EU, where it is true, as Stephen said, that the EU has not donated any vaccines to COVAX, or at least a very limited number to COVAX yet. But it has, on the other hand, in complete contrast to the United States, exported an increasingly and very rapidly rising number of vaccines around the world. Commission President von der Leyen mentioned last week that number was 155 million doses exported from the EU since December. But it's important to understand that that number is rising very, very rapidly. So it is by sort of loose back of the envelope calculations not unthinkable, in my opinion, that the exports from the European Union of vaccines could reach 100 million doses in the month of April alone. And that, of course, means exports, perhaps, if that level is sustained, which I don't see any reason for why it would not be, of 300 million doses of vaccines exported by the EU over the course by the end of the second quarter. Meaning that is the amount of vaccines the EU will have exported before a single vaccine probably leaves the United States. That is an indifference that I think is quite striking, and I think will have also perhaps some broader political implications. Having said that, on the other hand, I think vaccines is actually a transatlantic success story. Because if you look at the way vaccine development has emerged, the probably to date at least most effective set of vaccines, which are the newly mRNA vaccines, of which there are currently 2, soon to be 3 approved, namely the BioNTech, Pfizer, and Moderna vaccines. Probably in the course of May, it will be added to that the German-produced CureVac mRNA vaccines. This is essentially, at least when for BioNTech Pfizer, is a transatlantic success story, right? I mean, it's essentially a German technology mass-produced by an American company, Pfizer. And Moderna is also currently producing in Europe. And the reality is, especially since the Commission just today or yesterday signed a long-term agreement with BioNTech Pfizer for 1.8 billion doses, but up to 1.8 billion doses of this vaccine in 2022-23. This is mRNA vaccines are the future, if you like, of COVID vaccinations. And it will be, once both the United States and Europe are have populations fully vaccinated, it will be in the form of this type of vaccines donated to COVAX, which hasn't happened yet. So far, COVAX vaccines donation has entirely been AstraZeneca by and large. But that is the tool with which, if you like, vaccine diplomacy is going to be conducted. And that is going to be increasingly important because people forget that globally, the pandemic is at a record level. There are more global cases, of course, partly driven by India, but not exclusively India, today than at any point in time during the pandemic. At the same time, of course, the two major additional exporters, in addition to the European Union, India is quite naturally not exporting any vaccines at the moment, and China is actually on the brink of beginning to becoming a major vaccine importer of particularly Pfizer-BioNTech vaccines, because they have the Chinese vaccines do not appear to instill immunity to contagion. You can actually still be infectious even if you're vaccinated with the Chinese vaccines, which appears not to be the case by any of the mRNA vaccines or AstraZeneca for that matter. So I think if you look forward 2 to 3 months, the mRNA vaccines produced in Europe and the United States are going to be the principal tool with which, quote unquote, global vaccine diplomacy is being conducted. And it will be in the form of donated vaccines produced by these companies, rather than calls for sort of giving away IPR or releasing patent rights and that kind of thing. Because even if you did that, in my opinion, it's not going to make much of a difference because of the complexity of manufacturing these vaccines. So you wouldn't actually get many additional vaccines reaching the developing world, even if this were to happen. The method is donation by the companies in question. Then quickly, finally, on climate. There, of course, last week we got a very ambitious new statement by the Biden administration, a 50% reduction in the United States from 2005 level by 2030 is actually not that different from the European commitment of 55% from 1990 levels. So it's a comparable level of ambition, and twice the level of ambition of the Obama administration. I mean, if we just skip over the no commitment by the Trump. But again, Biden is twice as ambitious on climate as Obama was, roughly speaking. So that's the good news. The less good news is that we have also heard, or at least maybe not articulated, but implicitly made clear by the Biden administration that they're not going to pursue carbon pricing at the federal level. There's not going to be a federal, at least not proposed by the Biden administration, and it looks unlikely that Congress is going to do it out of its own volition. That poses a problem also for trade relations between the EU and the US, because, as is well known, the Parliament has just made its own proposal for a potential carbon border adjustment mechanism, and the Commission is scheduled to put forward its proposal by June. It is very clear, therefore, that, and by the way, when John Kerry was in Brussels a few weeks ago, I think it's pretty clear what he said on this issue, namely that the Biden administration would prefer if the European Union would put the CBAM, or border adjustment mechanism, on the quote-unquote back burner. That's not going to happen for no other reason that it's politically required in Europe. And given where carbon prices are now the ETS prices are now about 47, 48 euros and rising rapidly. That level of carbon prices makes a political imperative for a CBAM to be instituted even more. urging at the Europe. But what I think, if you want to avoid very dramatic Atlantic trade situation on this issue, is that a European CBAM would have to acknowledge that there are other ways, non-price-based ways of achieving the reduction, an ambitious reduction in, or an equivalent reduction in carbon intensity, which is basically what the Biden administration has committed to. So even if the US doesn't have a federal carbon price, it could very well, through other means, reach an equivalent level of carbon ambition. That needs to be reflected, I think, in the EU proposals to avoid what could otherwise be a very dramatic trade escalation. And it is, of course, somewhat ironic that it is the EU that is proposing a price-based carbon abatement strategy, which we cap and proposal, and it is the United States that is a more traditional regulatory approach to carbon abatement. But anyway, let me finish there. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Jakob, for those suitably conventional wisdom challenging remarks, which is what we associate with your interventions on these occasions, and extremely interesting they were indeed. Thank you. Now, we've got about a quarter of an hour for questions and answers, and we've got about half a dozen questions have come in. What I'm going to do is hoover these up in one go and invite our panel to respond to any or all of the issues which are raised, and they fall into several baskets. One basket is the one that we already had, but which I just flag up again, which is on the question of burden sharing within NATO, whether there are any insights that the panelists would like to share on that. Moving out to a slightly wider focus, Tatiana Guerra de Almeida asks the question of how far we can envisage continuity in any fields of bipartisanship on US foreign policy. I mean, clearly in the area of China, we might see that, but other areas as well. Andrew Bolton asks about transatlantic relations from a very specific direction, namely the implications of Brexit, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, the situation between Northern Ireland and Ireland, and I suppose, and I would add more generally, how the administration might play a role in trying to align America, the European Union, and Britain going forward. I know it's an issue on which quite a lot of people in Washington are interested in, less so, funnily enough, in either Brussels or in London. And then we have a range of political questions. When I say political, I mean domestic political. Richard Friedman has asked no less than 7 questions, but I think in the hope that one of them may be picked out. And I think it's a question which a lot of people would be very interested indeed in knowing your views on, which is, can the Republicans come up with a plausible, popular, indeed even rational candidate for 2024? And what do you think the prospects of such a candidate, were they able to generate it, him or her, be? So that's one question. Gordon McDougall asks the question, do you think it's possible that either Donald Trump or a member of the Trump family may run in the 2024 election? And I'd like to ask a question, particularly of Bruce, actually, which is, how do you rate the chances of this potential upgrading of the transatlantic legislators dialogue? I mean, are we in the territory of having some kind of transatlantic assembly? So maybe take Bruce first and then run through the panel one by one. Over to you, Bruce.
Thank you. First, let me address the issue of potential for bipartisan activity on foreign policy priorities. China, as you mentioned, and as I mentioned, is one. Given the level of anxiety or disapproval of Russia, I think that might be another, depending on what Russia does. But what's interesting is that in February, the Pew Research Center asked the American public about 20 different foreign policy priorities. And of those 20, you only had bipartisan support on protecting U.S. jobs, where even 2/3 of Democrats said that was the most important bipartisan priority. It was their single most important bipartisan priority for the middle class in the United States. Taking measures to protect the U.S. from terrorist action. One can imagine that would gain bipartisan support. Reducing the spread of infectious diseases. Again, who's going to say we shouldn't do that? And also preventing the weapons of mass destruction. So other than the weapons of mass destruction, disease, and terrorism, which you'd expect bipartisan support and you'd expect cooperation with Europe on that, the only issue where it seems to me that you could get bipartisan support from the public opinion data is on protecting U.S. jobs, which of course is a potential problem with Europe. On the improving the legislators' dialogue, I think the dirty little secret is this means more to the European Parliament members than it does to U.S. Congress members. Historically, it's been more difficult to get U.S. Congress members to engage in the legislators' dialogue, which to my mind is insane because more and more of the issues that bedevil the U.S.-European trade relationship and economic relationship involve Congress. They involve non-traditional trade issues that involve a broad range of congressmen. But frankly, Congress doesn't get it. And this proposal to give the legislators' dialogue more stature in the U.S. Congress has been put forward before. One would hope it would get some traction this time. What it means to the layman is that basically it would help congressmen justify to their constituents that they spend time on this. So that's useful. The idea of a transatlantic assembly, which is like the next step, is still, I think, an ambition, certainly one I share, but and I know others share. But whether it can be actualized in a relatively quick time frame, I'm hopeful, but I'm not going to bet a lot of money on it. And there's a third issue which I think doesn't get enough discussion, which is the European Parliament has an office in Washington. The U.S. Congress should establish an office in Brussels. It could be small to begin with, but if you establish an office in Brussels for the U.S. Congress, then coordination between the European Parliament and the U.S. Congress is enhanced dramatically. And I think that actually, even though it's not high in the discussion list in Washington, is the step that really should be taken and could be taken because it's purely in the control of the U.S. Congress to do this. And so I do think it's something we should consider.
Thank you very much for that. Next up, Fran.
Oops. Okay. Sorry, having problems with the mute button. You'd think we'd all know how to do that perfectly by now. On the burden sharing question, I think there are those in the new administration who realize the artificiality of the 2% in terms of defense contributions. But it is going to be politically challenging to justify dropping the 2% and significantly changing the way the 2% might be measured. We do expect that NATO will launch a new strategic concept exercise at the summit coming up in June, and it may be that in the context of that exercise, particularly as NATO sees more cybersecurity and other non-traditional defense elements creeping into its strategic concept, I think that is going to be, there could be an opportunity there. The other opportunity I would see is in Afghanistan and the arrangements that might be made as U.S. troops withdraw, not so much for other troops to remain, but what other kinds of security assistance might be provided in places like Afghanistan, like Mali, like Chad, where the U.S. wants to limit boots on the ground. But this is a really challenging issue politically in the United States. Let me say a couple words about Bruce's comments on upgrading the TLD and potentially an assembly. I think one can learn something from the experience of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. And there we see the pattern that Bruce suggested repeating itself, which is that although this is a very long-standing enterprise, it still struggles to ensure that it has American participants in all its meetings. Generally, there are one or two. There are not senators engaged. And they work, that assembly works on a committee system, doing reports. I think it has an advantage in the United States in that we're NATO members. And so it's like mom and apple pie. But nevertheless, those who participate in the delegation to the NATO Parliamentary Assembly find challenges in justifying their travel, particularly back when the assembly used to meet in, Paris and Rome and Milan and places like that to their constituencies. Since then, they've kind of downgraded some of the cities where they go intentionally to deal with this problem that the Americans have. So I think it's going to be tough sledding. I find it very frustrating, particularly in the Congress European Parliament discussion or lack of discussion. Their individuals do certainly have discussion. But it seems to me that in certain areas, whether it is, for example, content moderation or AI, but also many other non-tech issues, there are some real lessons that US members could learn from the European Parliament. I would not want to see all of the EP positions adopted wholesale. I'm not arguing for that, but I think that the way that the committees very seriously undertake the work would be instructive. The ideas that come out are the types of things that should be considered, evaluated. Some would work in the American system, some would not. And I'm just going to put something on the table here since we're starting the conference on the future of Europe. I think one of the things that has really over time made the US system more difficult is that members spend all their time not only fundraising, but introducing bills themselves. They introduce thousands of bills, most of which never go anywhere, and they do it to say to their constituents that I introduced a bill on X. And so I wonder if giving the Parliament the right of legislative proposal would be, in fact, a good thing. I'm not convinced that it would be, whereas this current system where you have an arrangement that if enough members of the Parliament say that they should have a bill on XYZ, the Commission has to come up with something. That could be strengthened even more. But I do think that the way we work is significantly different, and some of it may have to do with the rights of legislative initiative. On Ireland, just briefly, I think that this administration is going to strongly support the Good Friday Accord. President Biden is Irish, takes it very seriously. There are lots of other people in his administration whose sympathies are in that direction. I think one of the fascinating things to watch is going to be the evolution of US-UK relations, because most of the people in this administration think that Brexit was a bad idea, but it's happened now. However, they also took to heart that Obama's comments just before the referendum, his insertion of himself into the debate was not a good thing, was not constructive to the people that they supported. I do think that we will push the US and the UK and the EU to work together, particularly in security, anti-terrorism, issues like that. But it will happen on a case-by-case basis until we finally start to get the ball rolling, and then I think it'll happen more. So I think on those places where It has more to do with U.S. self-interest and that we want to ensure smooth information sharing between all the parties that are concerned with jihadi terrorism, for example. I think you will see efforts there. So let me leave it there.
Thank you very much indeed, Fran. I'm now going to ask Stephen if he'd like to pick up on one of these. And I'd also like to say that the New York Times carried a very interesting piece by Jonathan Alter recently entitled, "Can Biden Become the Next FDR?" But it seems to me that it's more like that he could potentially be LBJ without Vietnam. Let's hope. Stephen.
Yes, let's not have Vietnam all over again. That would be nice. We're out of time, so I'm going to say like 2 or 3 sentences. One is, can Trump come back again? Sure. Would a Trump family member come back? I don't think they're as good as he is at driving crowds. I hope he doesn't come back. That's the kind of chaos I don't think anybody particularly wants. But at the moment, I don't see the Republican Party stopping him. But we've got, it's early days yet. And as Fran said, you still see a lot of Trump signs around in America. Bipartisan, look, I mean, Congress certainly is bipartisan on NATO, on getting allies to spend more on defense, on confronting China and confronting Russia, right? I mean, that's bipartisan. Now, these are issues that are not that big in Europe, but maybe Europeans should think a bit more about them. The last thing I would say is there's a lot of concern in Washington, not just in Washington, about what happens after Angela Merkel, not just for Germany, not just for German policy toward Russia and China, but how the European Union works in the absence of someone who has been around for so long and has the kind of influence that she has built up over time. And given time, I think I'm just going to leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Stephen, over to Jakob for the final remarks.
Well, let me be very brief, partly since I seem to be chopped up a bit, but also just a quick word on Brexit and the Northern Irish situation. I'm actually more concerned about that probably than most, because it seems to me that where we're heading now that the local, DUP leadership is basically collapsing. There seems to be a weaponization by the British government of unionist grievances, which is not only against the Northern Ireland protocol, which is outcome of the Brexit that Boris Johnson wanted, but ultimately also against the Good Friday Agreement itself. And I think, therefore, that unless something more dramatic is done to solve that issue, which would include, I'm sure also very much more direct American and Biden administration involvement, you're going to end up in a repeat, unfortunately, of the scenes that you saw in Northern Ireland a couple of weeks ago, which is, for lack of a better word, a return to potentially low-scale violence. Which of course would be a politically unacceptable situation, I would contend, also for the Biden administration. So let me finish there.
Thank you very much indeed, Jakob. Thank you very much to all our panelists. Thank you also to Vice President METSOLA, who joined us so effectively at the start of this. And thank you to the, I think we peaked at about 150 people who were online listening to and some participating actively through questions in this particular event. It brings to the end a series of 3 EPRS events which we've done about the US presidential election and its aftermath. We looked at the situation a few days before the contest, about a month after the contest, and now at the end of, or towards the end of the 100 days of Biden's presidency. And we have been living through an extraordinarily exciting and interesting period in US politics. And I'd like to thank both the panelists today and indeed the panelists that we had on previous occasions for sharing their thoughts and insights with our European parliamentary audience. I'd like also to apologise for the fact that we had some interference on the line. There was some time lags and occasional drops, but I think everybody got the basic thrust of what each other was saying. We'll be doing 2 events, EPRS events, next week. On Tuesday, we'll be doing the second in a 2-part series about the multi-annual financial framework and next generation EU. The first was about negotiating the MFF and GEU. The second part is about the delivery of it. And we have a high-level panel to discuss some of the issues there. And then on Wednesday, the 5th of May, a few days in advance of Europe Day, the 9th of May, we're going to be looking at the political significance of Beethoven's Ode to Joy. And we have musicologists and political scientists reflecting on that. And I think that'll be of interest to very many people in and around the Brussels community. So thank you all once again, and to those on the other side of the Atlantic, thanks so much for making the effort and sparing the time to join us. For those here in Brussels, the same of course, and enjoy the rest of the day. Goodbye.